Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce you to Nancy Kinzinger. Nancy is the granddaughter to artist, teacher, and activist Edmund Daniel Kinzinger. Nancy told us some stories that I found so intriguing that I wanted to learn more, and I wanted her to share. Taught you how to read and write German when you were 6. Tell us more.
Well, this is primarily, you have to realize this is from the viewpoint of a child. But my grandfather was very reserved and spent a lot of time by himself. However, he was really a great grandfather because he did do things like read to us and draw with us and write with us and that sort of thing. And it was not unusual at all for him to spend a lot of time with us. So my family was a reading family, and when I was very young, he would read to me and show me how to write and do things like that. He was very much the teacher in some ways, but it was done with a very, I remember going and asking for him to let me write with him or let me draw with him or let me paint with him or read with him. And he would comply very happily, but he was a very reserved, and at that point, really quite a mentally ill person, but he did comply very well, and he did spend time with us doing all those things. Not he had not done a lot of painting or drawing or pastels or anything since he had retired officially. But my mother really encouraged him and bought him supplies and really made an effort to get him involved with other people and to get him active in life. And I think that one of the ways that he was active was interacting with us. And I think he did spend a tremendous amount of time with us doing a variety of things like reading.
Well, I know we had paintings in the sale we do have paintings in the sale. I think there's one that's done in 1958, so we do know that he painted to at least that date.
He did paint some, and he did draw some, and he did some pastels. I think that his mental illness as such was the type of mental illness. I mean, he was bipolar, basically, or manic depressive as they called it then. And he would go through some very highs and some very lows, and unfortunately I think the lows kind of outweighed the highs. It was unfortunate for him, but I think it was fortunate in that he did lead a relatively cloistered life once he came to live with my family. His social circle really and was the people that my parents knew, and he was included on things, and I mean he was a very active member of our family, but he was also very reserved, and even as a child I knew that he was damaged, basically. I knew that he had become shell-shocked during the war, and I didn't really understand what shell-shock was, but I knew that he was very young when that happened.
Well, your memory is so keen that you can remember such incredible detail when you were young with Edmund, but also you remember all the stories, and that's the whole idea, is to not let these stories die, let them be known.
Well, and there are a lot of things that I do remember. I very specifically remember lying in a baby carriage and having my sister would buy gumballs in different colors. And my grandfather and she would stand there and hold them up and say yellow or red or blue. And so from a very young age, we were really exposed to a lot of color. And realistically, I grew up with these paintings on the wall, and there was not a tremendous amount of discussion about them, but there were things that happened that were very specifically related to those paintings. I remember my mother saying that my mother did not like Pablo Picasso, and I remember talking to her about why, and she said, well, when he was in the country once, he contacted your grandfather and said that he was going to come and visit, and then he didn't. And I think part of that, again, in his later years, he really did have some mental illness, and I think that was difficult for people to deal with. And I think it was difficult for other artists to deal with, as well as, I mean, just the general public. My apparently he was very excited because he was going to have a peer to visit. And
well, he stayed with him for a little
yes,
while.
he did. Yes, he did. And I think that when Edmund left Germany, I think it was a very bittersweet leaving. I think it was very difficult in some ways to leave the group of people that were in Europe, the group of artists that were in Europe, and come to a new country. I think that I think he felt very. I want to say, well, bittersweet is a good word, but I think he felt very torn about the entire trip. His wife had left at that point and taken his daughter with him.
Second wife.
That's right, his second child. And I think that there was a desire to escape from what was happening in Germany. And what was happening in Germany was very dark, and it was one of Edmund's focuses in life, I think, was I want to say the downtrodden, but basically people that were the common people. And I think that he had seen very specifically what had happened to gypsies and such in
We
Germany.
see it in his art.
Exactly. He knew very specifically what had happened to people that were of the working class, and he understood what was going on. And I think that when in pre-World War II, I think that when things really started to tighten up ideologically in Germany, I think he really felt the pressure that he needed to get out, and that what he was feeling and believing about art and about life was really going to come into question by the government. And I think having lived through World War I and been in the trenches and been shell-shocked and had the events of that time period fresh in his mind, I think he really knew he needed to leave. But I think it was very tough in some ways.
Well, he went back several times, didn't he?
Yeah, well, he had gone back before he actually left that time after, I think they left when my father was 25, and that was in 34.
And your father was his only son.
That's right.
From his first wife, who tragically died by the gunshot ricocheted off a chandelier.
Yeah, she was killed in a bizarre accident. Edmund and Amelia were married when they were quite young, and she was killed when they went to a masquerade party, and someone who was dressed as an American cowboy shot off in the 20s, shot off his guns, and one of them was loaded and hit the chandelier and ricocheted and killed her instantly. And I think that happened in 22, I think, and I think considering the fact that Edmund had just come through World War I and had severe shell shock from that, I think it really added to a lot of the emotional issues that he perhaps manifested later in life. But my father basically grew up in boarding schools.
Well, rather aristocratic family.
It was.
And I gotta say, he was a bit of a dish.
Yeah, well,
I heard. Right?
Well, and I think Edmund went through a time period where he traveled a lot, and I think he, was just looking to eke out a living at that point. And I think he sort of traveled in some of those artistic circles and really tried a lot of different things and met a lot of different people. I think it was very hard on my father because he spent so much time in a boarding school. And my father used to talk about how he didn't talk a lot about those years in his life, but he did say that it was a very difficult time period for him, and the economy in Germany was so awful.
And here he started that he was part of the starters of the group.
Yes.
The group with Willy Baumeister and Oscar Schlemmer.
Exactly, and I think Edmund found some solace in that. He found a group of like-minded individuals, and I think that probably for him, since his wife had been killed, I think art was his life, and I think that he really traveled and really had an opportunity to see things and do things, and I think it was a very formative time period for him, and I think it was one of those things where he really got to immerse himself in everything that was happening in the European sphere during that time period. I do think, though, that it really also, he met his second wife, Alice, who was an American student who was studying in Europe. And once he and Alice were married, and they had a daughter, Delia, who, as I said, Alice and Delia or Dee emigrated to the United States before the beginning of World War II, they really encouraged him to come, and they wanted him to come, obviously. But I think it was very difficult for him to tear himself away from those peers. But I think it was a double-edged sword. I think that the opportunity to go somewhere new and do something new and actually be able to work in an established situation was probably very appealing. Like I said,
But it was kind of Baylor University.
Well,
I mean, it was,
I know. I do think that
must have felt like going from sort of a radical
exactly
to Baylor.
I think that was something that he really did not understand until he got to this country and got to Baylor, that he understood really the conservative religious nature of that university. I think it really forced him to change the focus of what he was doing in some ways. I mean, this was a European painter who had spent a lot of time in traditional situations, studying nudes and working with form and that sort of thing. And I think when he came to Baylor and he understood that he could not do that at that point, that was not something that was acceptable, that I think that it really pushed him to maybe focus on some different things. I don't think that ever his eye or his feeling of the working class and people really ever changed. I think it just changed the way that he could interpret those things and that he could look at different things. And I think the fact that he was probably in Texas and in an area where the light was very different and that where colors were very different, that those things began to have this kind of a different meaning for him, and that they did come out.
There's one known painting that he did that is actually of Texas.
No.
Although he went to Tahoe, so it seemed to me like it must have been every weekend or every opportunity he had.
I think there
and
was
Costco.
Yeah. Well, and I think it was one of those things where that was an escape for them, and I think that his life with Alice was good. They had Dee Dee, and I think life was good during those years, and I think that it was an opportunity for him to go somewhere and maybe.
And that's when he got his doctorate in art. There's
yes.
not too many people have that.
Exactly, and I think that all those things, that was in Iowa, I think all those things kind of combined. It was the Midwest, it was, if you are an Easterner or a Westerner in this country, the Midwest and the Southwest have sort of their own, they have their own light and they have their own way of looking at things. And I think it's very different. And I do think that it sort of forced him into changing what he was focusing on. But I think it's interesting that he didn't do anything that was specifically Texas art. I think the shock of going to a place where he had to change again was very overwhelming. And I think that the having to not abandon, but I think maybe synthesize his ideas and sort of try to move on from what he had been doing to doing something new and different and looking at different things and really focusing on different things really pushed him to look for things that were sort of outside the establishment.
Well, it's amazing what he accomplished, considering he was mentally ill.
He was, and I think that probably, very realistically, I think that the effect of World War I, the shell shock, I think losing his wife at an early age and in a pre-World War II Germany, I think that was probably a very difficult place to live, and I think a lot of Europe was very difficult.
Well, didn't his second wife left him?
Yeah, and that's eventually Delia, or Dee Dee as he called her. Dee Dee actually went to University of Colorado, and Dee Dee had resisted becoming an artist. Apparently, she got quite a bit of pressure from her parents.
The daughter.
Exactly. But Dee Dee became an architect, and she went to college in Colorado. And when she graduated, she got married almost immediately to a man who was Indian, and immediately moved to India. And so I think that again, for Edmond, I think that second family had been a savior in some ways, and I think that once Dee Dee left, and I think a lot of things probably happened, and he eventually got to the point where he could not function as the chairman of the Department of Art anymore.
But it was your father and your mother and yourself. You stayed such a tight family, and
Well,
a family that doesn't abandon.
Well, I think that what and I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I do think that what happened, I think Dee Dee escaped, and I think that her mother, Alice, who was his second wife, probably did the same thing very quickly thereafter. And living with someone that has mental illness, you get to the point where you can't deal with it anymore, and I think that's what happened with Alice and Edmund. And my mother came from a very strong family that their feeling was, and her and my father's feeling, excuse me, all their life was that, you do not abandon family. So my mother and my father had ended up in the Midwest, and I want to say in Indiana. He became a naturalized citizen and that sort of thing. But he had worked. His degree was in research chemistry, and he was a chemist. And he came to this country before World War II. And
he was 25.
He was very young, but because of the I want to say
he was schooled in Germany.
He was schooled in Germany, and his PhD was in chemistry. And when he came to this country, there was much distrust of Europeans from that time period. It was right after World War I. He spent a lot of years pumping gas and doing things like that, but he had finally gotten himself into a situation where he was working as a chemist, and he was very grateful. But my mother and father ended up really stepping in and taking Edmund in at that point. And my mother went to Texas and got him, and brought him home, and at that.
But he was strong. He was strong-willed. The story that I remember you telling me was something about he disappeared, and next thing you've got to tell that story.
Well, my parents originally lived in Pennsylvania, and after they moved to Wisconsin, my grandfather disappeared. Edmond disappeared, and they weren't really. It was apparently he had been having a very down time, and at that point that he was not being treated medically for his bipolar disease, but he had been having a very down point, and he was very depressed, and he disappeared. And it was winter, and within probably, I want to say, they did report it to the police very quickly, because they were very concerned. And after about 10 days, it turned out that he had gone back to Pennsylvania, to the town next door to the one that they had lived in, where Edmund had lived for some time period with them, not just for a couple of years. And my father ended up having to borrow a truck from work, because they didn't have a car that would make it all the way back to Pennsylvania. He borrowed a truck from work and drove out to get my grandfather.
And where did they find him?
Well, he was in Pennsylvania. He was staying in a hotel, and actually, by that point that I think that my father got out there, he was in jail. He was in local jail because he had gone on basically a high and decided that he was gonna go make.
Did he convince everybody he was a multi-millionaire?
Yeah, he was going to go make himself up into someone important, and he convinced everybody that he was a multi-millionaire, and that, he'd spent money in town and stayed in the local hotel and sort of done this and that. And, it was, I think that my mother said that when my father got there, the sheriff said, well, we obviously had something the matter with him, apparently. They figured that out pretty quickly. Because he was delusional, and the sheriff said to my father, well, don't worry about it, I've talked to the hotel folks, and everybody's fine, you don't owe us any money, you just need to take him back and get him taken care of, which was really very generous during that time period for someone to say that. But my father was horrified and thought, no, I can't do that.
Yeah, you said that all the way back, Edmund played his guitar, just jolly as can be, while your father was trying to figure out how he was going to pay
Well,
everyone back.
exactly. And my grandfather Edmond sat in the back of the truck and played his guitar the entire way back from between Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. You know, through snowstorms and through this and through that. And it was one of those things where, excuse me, by the time he got back, it was, you know, my father was convinced, okay, now I've got to figure out how I'm going to pay all these people, because my father had grown up, you know, during World War I or after World War I, and in World War II you did not pay people money that you owed them. So yeah, he really, Edmund, that was probably the beginning of, he did spend some time in institutions, and there's some.
He was brilliant. I mean, I've had the joy of his estate is going up to auction at iGavelAuctions.com online, and I've had the joy of going through his books, even though they're in German and I don't speak German. But his notes, and you could just tell he was brilliant, and his writings.
Yeah.
When I came across some of his writings on the brochure, I had to put it on the site because I just thought how eloquent. Someone had just asked him, "What is your art?" And he just, in a few sentences, just
summed it all up.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I know, and I think that was probably, even as a child, it was very obvious to us that he was very special, and that he did exist in a different world, and that even though he was mentally ill, and he did spend some time in institutions, it was one of those situations where it was obvious. We were in a tornado when I was a little girl, and I lived in Wisconsin, and I remember my mother herding us down into the basement, and my grandfather came down, and we had bubble windows that you could look out, and I remember standing there and him picking us up to look out at the tornado and say, you know, look at the power of nature, kind of thing. He was just, you know, even though he was mentally ill, he was still there.
Oh.
And I think that was.
Well, he was a brilliant professor. I mean, you know.
And I think that was probably most obvious with us. I think he did spend time with us, and he did spend, you know, like I said, my first memories of really. Almost my first memories are of that gumball and the different colors, and let's talk about the colors. This is yellow, this is blue, red, red, red. And I must have been very, very small to be in a, you know, perambulator or baby buggy kind of thing. But you know, I think that my parents really did make an effort to include them in their lives, and to really, he was extremely fond of my mother. My mother was, you know, his entire world in many ways during his later years, and I think the fact that he did paint and do some things.
Well, he never got frail or anything. He seemed, just in his later pictures, I mean, tall, handsome, strong-willed man.
And he was.
You know, it wasn't like he was dependent, or at least he didn't know he was.
No, not at all. And I think that was something that my mother had really made an effort to do with him, to include him, and to, I mean, he did, my memory is that he did read a lot, he did walk a lot, you know, we spent many, many hours outside, even in Wisconsin, we spent many, many hours outside.
From his books, some that are inscribed to him in little notes and stuff, that I know that he kept a lifelong friendship with Godfrey Gath. I know that he really, I don't know how long he was friends or kept a friendship with Willie Baumeister, but he thought enough of him to take that one study that he did and actually seal it so it wouldn't deteriorate, no other air would get to it.
Yeah.
So that, and there were some other books that Willie Baumeister had inscribed to him, so they must have kept a friendship. Well, I know Godfrey Gath kept a friendship up to the 50s because just of the notation.
Oh, sure, and I think that there were people that were on the periphery of his life. You know, mental illness is an awful thing, and I think that those people kind of came and went as far as they could deal with his illness. I do know that we did have lots of visitors. We always had lots of visitors, but that was a normal part of our life, and so I feel certain that many of those people did probably even come to see him.
I think he befriended Diego Rivera. I have there's one photograph a very young.
Yeah.
I thought that was him. I thought, well, that looks like Diego Rivera when he was 18 or
Yeah,
something.
I think that there were a lot of people within that world. I think that was part of what made it so difficult when he left Europe, because that was really before a lot of pre-continental,
Mm-hmm.
travel or anything like that. I mean, it really was before people spent a lot of time going over the,
Mm-hmm.
over the pond.
But he did go home. He did go home to Germany a few times, didn't
He
he?
did when he was younger, yes. But once he left, he was gone. He did not go back to Germany, and I think part of that was, um, I think life had been very hard for him in Germany. He came from a large family, and some of those cousins and some of those I probably first and second cousins did end up back here, over here in the States. And I think once that happened, I think he had a very loose knit group
Mm-hmm.
of people that he kind of considered
Mm-hmm.
family, and he did. There was some contact with them. Once Alice moved, Alice, who was his second wife, once Dee Dee got married and went to India and started having kids, and Alice and Edmund were divorced, Alice ended up going to India also. And Alice would write, and I think it gave him an opportunity to kind of stay in touch with that part of the family. Um, there, they, there are a lot of there are a lot of pieces of all that I think were about his relationships with other people that were very fractured. I think he had a very difficult time once he really got into the throes of his illness in maintaining contact with people and that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. I do remember as a child that he would receive, when he received letters or anything like that, he would have my mother open them and read them to him, um, sometimes multiple times, so that he could really absorb what the person was saying. And
But through his career, he did regularly exhibit. Not that often, but
no, but when he was younger, he did quite a bit.
yeah, and overseas.
Yes, he did. He did, and there were, I think, a couple here in the States. But I think for him, um, at that point, I think he continued to paint and work on his own. But I think he had really become the teacher at that point. I
Mm-hmm.
think that had really, in his personality, that had really come forth.
Mm-hmm.
I think that his illness really knocked that away from him, and I think that was tough. I think that was one of the reasons probably he spent so much time with us when we were young. It was because we were, the apt students. We were,
Well, we're in Germany and France, and I mean, we have lots of exhibit
yeah,
records on.
exactly, exactly. But I think once he came to this country, I think he was looking at some different things, and it wasn't the, accepted art like you said earlier. I think
Mm-hmm.
that he had really had really focused on the downtrodden in many ways, and the common man, and I think some of that carried forth here. And I think it was an opportunity for him to, I think it was sort of the natural leaving what he did of his European training and going to the New World kind of thing. And I think it really was kind of a new thing, but I think he really did look at the people, the common people that were there, and I think that was really what interested him. I think it was probably, I mean, it was probably horrifying to realize that you were working for a university where all, much of the training that you'd had in art, the things that you'd looked at in the human body, it was not appropriate for you to have nudes.
Right. So
So,
as a child, when Edmund was, I understand he died of a stroke.
yes, he did.
Um, so, but in the last year of his life, what was your relationship with Edmund like? I mean, what memory do you walk away with?
Well, I think the realization that, as my sister said, time had flung her cloak around him. He was quite vibrant. Um, my memory during that last year really is probably that he does, in many ways, pull more into his pre-American shell. He really spent a tremendous amount of time in his room reading and studying. I mean, that was one of the things that he did all his life. That no matter what was going on with him mentally,
Mm-hmm.
he continued to study. He continued to read. He would take out things and just sketch a little bit and draw, and he would talk to us about it. But he did spend a lot of time, I think, in those years where he had some very vibrant relationships with other artists, and I think that was probably the toughest part of his mental illness, was really losing those relationships and not being able to continue with those people. But he really did spend a lot of time, and he spent a lot of time with us. There was a lot of reading and a lot of looking at. We would look at books and talk about, just, look at this. And
so he was always the teacher too.
He was always the teacher, and he really, his health had actually been quite good until just there at the very end. So that really was what I remember. He smoked a pipe, and I think probably also smoked cigarettes at times, but just the tobacco smell, and just sitting at a desk, probably sitting at a desk with him, and no matter how big we were, he still put us on his lap, and sitting there on his lap and talking about, looking at books and looking at art, and just talking about it, and talking about color and line and that sort of thing. So he was always the teacher, but yes, that's really probably my strongest memories, and probably because there are so many senses involved, were really of being in his room with him, and just talking to him. So it was, I really remember very little about his mental illness. I do remember a few incidents that had to do with, he would have to be institutionalized at times, and I remember he was very fond of some friends of my parents, and she came over and walking. I remember my mother telling us to go into our rooms and close the door, but I remember, peeking out, and she was walking down the hall with a tray of cocktails that, to serve Edmond's, because he was going to have to be institutionalized. And he was a big man. He was a very tall man, and like you say, he was not small. So I think institutionalizing was very tough for him, because it always had to be done under protest. And I remember a little bit of that, but I really remember a very benign, very kind. His kindness and his willingness to interact with us was, I think, very. That was probably the largest thing that I remember about him, is that he really did interact with us, and he really did come down to our level in many ways.
We're going to have to wrap this up. But is there anything you'd like to say in parting with? I think you've done really well, and I know there's loads more stories.
There are lots of stories, but I think probably the thing that is...
Well, let me just say, Nancy is putting pen to paper, and a future publication. So
I think probably the thing that I would like for people to know, or to think about, is that, this was someone who was really a peer for many other great artists that have received much acclaim and that sort of thing. And I think he belongs among the very top and the very best. I grew up with his art hanging on my walls, and it was, even as a child, it was surprising to me to go somewhere and to see, art that looked like my grandfather's. And I remember saying, gee, to my mother, gee, what's that? And my mother was like, oh, that's Brock, or that's this person, or that's that person. And I'm like, well, that looks like Grandpa's. She said, well, they were contemporary, and they were working during the same time period. And I think that he had a very interesting life. And
well, it seems like he should have got more recognition.
And that's really what I would like for him, is I would like for his art to have more recognition, because it is, I think it really does. I think it's interesting from a variety of viewpoints, but I think the fact that there are a variety of styles, that there's a European style and during that time period, then when he comes to this country, it changes, the subject matter changes, there's different things that are involved in the artwork.
But he's the Cubist starter. He's one of the Cubist
Exactly.
starters, one of a few.
Exactly.
And I just think that his work really should be
Which should be
at
recognized,
yes.
exactly, and looked at closely. And I always took that for granted, but when I really started looking at other people's art and looking at when all these things started, I thought, my God, he was on the forefront of
Oh yeah.
these art,
Yeah.
things that were happening, and that was just, was never recognized for those things.
Well, I guess the circumstances of the time.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that, him coming to this country and kind of changing that whole sphere of people, that probably contributed to it also.
Yeah, I would think so, because all the rest were have renown.
Exactly, exactly. And when you look at his work, and when you put it in context with everything else that's out there, with the history of art during that time period, he really was cutting edge in many of those areas. And I think the cubism, and I think the abstraction, and when you really look at when he was working on those things, he was working in the.
Oh, is it Albert Holtzell that he was?
Yes.
Yeah, he was his premier student.
Yes. Yes, and I think that's, he was in the trenches doing a lot of these things, and you really, when you go back and look at his work, you really understand that he was really at the cutting edge of a lot of those things. So, but I think a lot of that disappeared when he left. A lot of that fame, or or the recognition when he came to this country was kind of a whole new start. It was something different. So
we're going to have to wrap this up,
Sounds
and I really
good.
appreciate this. And I want to announce that the estate of Edmund Daniel Kinzinger is online at iGavelAuctions.com starting January 14th, ending the 28th. And thank you for your time.